Okay, I think we're on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm not going to spend any time with introductions. I want Pete, Dr. Rutigliano, to be able to spend as much time as we have on the material. I'll be letting folks in as they join. If you have questions, please make a note of them or put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat as we go along. Some questions may be answered in the moment. I'll be monitoring it. Some questions will be left to the end, but we will make sure to get your questions answered. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rutigliano.
Great. So thank you for the intros. So yes, my name is Pete Rutigliano. I've been working at Mercer now for about 18 years. My background, I have a PhD in clinical psychology and health psychology, and I've been doing this kind of work for the better part of 30 years. So I'm very excited to get into the data with you guys. As we go through this, one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is we did this survey as a means of gathering some data, what's going on with your employees. And two trends that we've been seeing fairly consistently. One has been since COVID, which is healthcare has been the #1 problem from an industry perspective, but not too far behind it is education and public office. Especially within the last 6 months to a year, we've been seeing a lot more turbulence in the data. So as we're going through these results, keep that context in mind. In fact, I'm going to talk about context in the next couple of pages. All right. So let's get cracking. So as we go through this, our agenda for today is to really talk about the results. Now, what's different about this training compared to the one previously is the previous training was more about this is what the report is. Where can I find certain things? This is more about, well, what does it mean and what can I do with it? And as so that these are the 5 different steps that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what action planning is and why it's important. We're going to talk about how we're going to understand the survey reports a little bit better. We're going to work on interpreting the report data. And then the 2 pieces at the end, which is conducting a feedback meeting and develop an action plan. This is where we take the effort that people have put into doing a response into action. And that's a really important part of this. And I'll talk about that a little later. One thing, though, I do want you guys to take a note now because I'm probably going to forget. I'll highlight it as I go through the slides, but there are 5 most important slides that I'm going to be going over, and they're going to be slides 8, 23, 24, 30, and 39. Again, it's 8, 23, 24, 30, and 39. And the reason I'm specifically bringing up those numbers is because those are the slides that people tend to review after I do my training. All right, so without further ado, let's first talk about why is this important. We want to turn survey data into action. Well, the #1 reason why is because we've done a lot of research at Mercer where we've connected together how people's employee well-being impacts performance. We know that well-being impacts employees' engagement. The more I'm connected to my job, the better I'm going to perform. But even on top of that, it makes logical sense, right? If I'm struggling with emotional issues or financial issues or health issues, that's going to get in the way of me effectively performing my job. That's why this is so critical. And we've shown these results and how it compares to turnover. We find that people who have better well-being and are more connected to their job are much less likely to leave the organization. In terms of absenteeism, this one's a real obvious one. The more mentally healthy I feel, and the more physically healthy, the less likely I'm going to be missing work. We know that to be true. And in fact, the one all the way on the left-hand side, team performance, I like this one the best because my parents wanted me to be a real doctor and not a psychologist. We did research with the National Weather Service, and we found that we looked across all of their agencies, and we found that the agencies that had the best engagement and the best well-being scores were most likely to have the most accurate means of predicting tornadoes, which is huge when you think about it. So what I like to say is, yes, my job does save lives, right? And that's one of the things that's really critical about this. The healthier people are at work, the more engaged they are at work, the more connected, the better the performance. And by the way, there's also these business performances at the bottom, but we're going to skip over those because who cares about business? So moving right along, right? So why is action planning important? Well, we've already talked about the fact that well-being leads to better performance, and it's really self-evident, right? I know that when I was going through some difficult times with, let's say, my spouse or my children or whatnot, it gets in the way of me being able to effectively perform at work, right? It takes away from my joy at work because I'm distracted. So I know that to be true. But there's the other piece of it also. I know that if I create a healthy work environment, I can actually impact positively the people at home. And that's one of the reasons I love what I do. Because as a psychologist, I know I can fix people that are having difficulties with their private life. But I also know that I could help people in their work life, which will impact their private life, right? There was this expression when I was a kid that, it's sexist, but it is what it is, where the man gets yelled at by the boss at work. So he comes home and yells at the wife, and then the wife yells at the kid, and the kid kicks the dog, right? I know we could flip that on its head. We can make a better experience at work so that when people are at work are having a better experience, it causes a better performance across their lives. The other thing about this also, and this is really critical, I'm sure you guys have taken hundreds of surveys in your lives, and I don't take them as often as I probably should, especially being a survey guy. And the reason why is I'm like, well, what happens with this data? And what I love about well-being surveys and what I love about engagement surveys is that those are the few surveys where I actually get to see the results of my effort. And this is a really critical part of this. If we take a survey as an employee in the organization, it is our duty as an organization to report back to the people, this is what we heard, and this is what we're doing about it, right? And that's why we say inaction leads to frustration. And this is so common that I hear this in organizations. I've taken these surveys 3 times, and nothing has changed, right? We want to turn that on its head, and that's a real critical part of this. The other thing about this that's really important too is that small steps lead to big improvement. You don't have to have a big, bold statement. You make little changes and that impacts people in a positive way. That makes a big difference in the long run. And I always like the expression, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. It's the same thing. Making small adjustments, small steps will lead to bigger improvements. And then the last part is by taking action, it leads to higher performance in the end. We've done this literally hundreds of times where I've done these trainings and we've actually seen organizations take action on the results, and I see the results improve over time. And people begin to feel like, wow, my company really cares about me because they put this effort into the survey results. So that's really what we're trying to drive here. So this is a very simple slide. What's the best way forward? Well, right now we have the report and we want to make things better. And I know that action leads to improved engagement and improved well-being. And that's where we want to get. So before we do so, I want to talk about what are the things that get in the way. And these are 4 what we call derailers, or things that keep me from being successful in action planning. The first one is analysis paralysis. And to be honest with you, I'm totally guilty of this. I'm a geek. I like data, and I will look at data and ask questions of data until I strangle the data. And I know that that's not a great thing to do. Analysis paralysis is where we look at the data, we ask questions of data, and we say, well, wait a minute. What if we dug into the data here? Maybe that explains something. And then I do a little bit digging there. And then I say, oh, wait, maybe if I dig in a little bit deeper, that's the problem. At one point, you have to draw a line in the sand and saying the data is what the data is, and we need to take action on it. That's really the goal I want for you guys. The second thing is we don't want to rush the solutions. When you see your results, there's a couple of things that you'll say, oh, I knew that all along. But there should be some things like, wow, that kind of confuses me, or I'm not really sure what that is. You don't thoroughly rush the solutions. You want to have a couple of ideas in your head, but you want to keep an open mind because maybe your interpretation isn't the same interpretation of other people in your group. So that's a real critical part of this. And that's part of the reason why we do the feedback meeting, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We want to get consensus amongst our group so we have a feel for what's going on and then decide the actions we want to take. The last two are under personalization and over personalization. I call these the two extremes, and we want to land it just right. Over personalization is where I blame myself with the results. Oh, I'm a bad boss. I should be doing a better job. You start feeling guilty about things, right? Sometimes, you know what? It has to do with the environment. Maybe we're not doing as much sales because of one reason or another, or maybe, perfect example as an educator during COVID, it was much harder to teach students during COVID. Well, you can't take total blame yourself for that, right? Part of that is the situation. But I also don't want to completely underpersonalize it and throw my hands up and say, well, it was COVID. I had no choice. I couldn't do anything about it. You still want to do the best you can. You can take some control over it, right? So when looking at over personalization, under personalization, you want to get that right size where I do have some control, but I want to make sure that I don't beat myself up. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. So what are the steps we want to take? So the steps we want to take are on this action roadmap. Very simply, we're going to understand the report. We're going to go over this at a pretty high level. Then we're going to talk about interpretation of the results. I'm going to go into that a little more detail. We're going to talk about conducting the effective feedback meetings. And then the last piece about it is we're going to talk about how to take action plans. By the way, as we're going through these results, right, sometimes I'll slip. I've done this presentation literally hundreds of times, and I might say, manager, when I think about taking action and putting actions together, I'm thinking all of you guys as change agents, whether that's a manager, whether that's a leader, whether it's maybe an ERG, or maybe someone who's an ambassador of change or something like that. I'm putting all of those roles within this one space of leaders or managers. Okay. So if I say manager, it's by mistake. I really mean people that are change agents. Sometimes you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So as you're thinking about the results, think about how I can evidence change as a change agent within the organization. So let's talk a little bit about understanding your report. Now, I know you guys have all had access to your reports for a couple of weeks now, and you probably went and saw Debbie's training on how to review the results. I'm going to go through this chapter pretty quickly. And the big difference here is I'm going to talk about the chapter in terms of what I use it for and what chapters I spend more time and less time in. So this should go actually fairly quickly, probably about 7 minutes for this section. Real quick, I know Debbie probably reviewed this with you guys. Keep in mind, we always want to make sure to remind people of the confidential nature of this. So the reports are only going down to a minimum N of 200. That means that 200 people had to respond in order to build a report. Each organization, school, or agency received a report provided they had at least 200 respondents to it. In addition, we also do comparisons, and I'll talk a little bit more about these comparisons, but you're going to see comparisons to OEB overall, and you're going to see comparisons to the benchmarks, and I'll talk about that. One of the reasons why that's really critical, when I was in school, and let's say a grade came back from a teacher and it said, oh, you got a 78. I never knew how well I did until I found out how the rest of the kids in the class did. Perfect example, my son just took one of his finals today and he came downstairs, right? And he just told me, hey, I got a 75 on the test. I'm like, oh, dude, Paul, what happened? He said, Dad, I got the highest grade. And I'm like, okay, that's a big difference. A 75 and you got the highest grade is very different than I got a 75 and I got the lowest grade. It's important to have those benchmarks in there, the comparison to OEB and comparison to Mercer norms, because we want to see where do we fit into the equation. So in understanding a report, this one is going to be a little bit of review. Favorable represents a strongly agree or agree response. Neutral is neither agree nor disagree. And then unfavorable is a disagree or strongly disagree response. The reason why we put it into percent favorables is because honestly, it's easier to understand the data. If I said to you guys, hey, you got a 3.7 on a score, that really doesn't mean much. But if I say 75% of people said this, that means you could look at a room of, let's say, 100 people, and in that room of 100 people, 75 agreed with that statement and 25 didn't. It makes the data a lot more meaningful, which is why we always use percent favorable. Um, Additionally, we show comparisons and we highlight meaningful difference. A 5-point difference or more is considered meaningful. If it shows up in green, that means you're ahead of the curve. If it shows up in red, that means you're below the curve. And you want to look at those for both OEB as well as the benchmarks. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of chapters. So these are the chapters of the report. I'm going to go over each one of these fairly quickly. The first chapter that I like to review, so I get these reports, I always look at the dashboard. And in the dashboard, I like to get an overview of what's going on with the survey, what's going on with my people. It gives me a 50,000-foot view. I want to know which scores am I seeing a lot of green, which ones I'm seeing a lot of red. So in this example, right, social is pretty high, physical is pretty high, and then financial is a little lower. That's pretty much the most I get out of this. To be honest with you, I don't even look at the 3 most favorable and 3 most unfavorable. There's another chapter for that. I completely skip it altogether. Then I go on to the next page, which are the top and bottom items. But basically, this is an expanded view of the slide before. These are the most favorable items and the least favorable items. I don't spend a lot of time on this. Again, this is like a think there. How are things going overall? What I like to do on this page is I look for themes in the most favorable. What content areas am I seeing showing up the most? And then I make a mental note of that. All right, I'm going to look at that a little later. Which ones are the most common things I'm seeing in the unfavorable? Do I see a lot of things about finance showing up there? Is a lot of things about emotional health? Is there a lot of things about health overall? I just try to get a feel for it. Again, my opportunity to get a 50,000-foot view. To be honest with you, I look at this when I first see the report, and then I usually never look at it again. Pretty much the same for the action priority grid. Some people love this, some people hate this. What this is supposed to do is to give you guys a feel for how am I comparing to my #1 benchmark, which would be OEB overall, the company, the organization that we belong to. I know that there's a lot of differences across OEB, but it gives you sort of a feel for, hey, how are we doing overall? And given that we'll never have a perfect benchmark for people, it's always nice to have this as a general rule of thumb. So what I'll do is I'll get a feel for what are the number of items that I have that are clear strengths, right? That are 75% or higher, and they're higher than OEB overall. And then I'll look at the things that are lower in favorability and then lower than OEB. Gives me a feel. Again, this is one of those, my first chance to look at the report, I get a feel, and then usually I don't come back to this chapter. The heat map, it's kind of unfortunate the heat map happens on this page because heat map is like a second phase of the analysis. The purpose of the heat map is to give you a feel or how do I fall into context at more of a macro level. It's a way of drilling down into the data. You can get really great into here to look at specific different populations and whatnot. This is a phase 2 analysis. I typically skip this altogether when first looking through the results. But when I want to drill down a little deeper, get more information, that's when I'll go into the heat map. The chapters that I typically spend the most amount of time on is the item detail chapter and the all items chapter. In fact, the all items, I'll get to it. That's my favorite chapter. The item detail chapter gives me the results of my organization overall. So you get all of the responses in here. You can see the fave, neutral, unfave, and then how it compares to the various benchmarks. I like this because it focuses me on my overall organization without digging deeper into my data quite yet. I do want to look at that, but again, that's sort of like a phase two of my analysis. I first want to be able to tell the story, hey, what's going on in my organization? And that's where I spend the most time. I like the item detail because it's broken out by dimension, so it makes it a little easier to understand the data. But this is one of those chapters I'll spend the most time in. When I go to phase two, sometimes I'll also do a drill down view where I'll look at individual results and dig down a little bit deeper. Again, this is a phase two. I want to first be able to tell the story of what's going on in my data. So what's my overall story? And then maybe some explanation. So as an example, let's say communication was a problem within the organization. The first thing I want to say is, hey, overall, communication within my part of the organization is a little bit lower than I'd like to see it. This is how we compare to OEB, and this is how we compare to the benchmarks, right? That's an important part of the story. But then from there, someone's going to follow up and say, well, do you have variability within your organization? And if you have enough people in your organization, you could drill down and say, hey, this particular area or this school or this agency or whatever is the lowest performing of the groups underneath me. Sometimes it's nice to tell that story. And then from an actioning perspective, if I have, let's say my score was in the 60s, but when I look at my data overall, I had two groups in the 80s and then one group was in the 50s. Well, when I'm taking action, that one group in the 50s is the one I'm going to want to emphasize some of those changes the most. Unique items, these are any questions on the survey that doesn't follow that standard 5-point fave, neutral, unfave scoring. It's a good way of getting a feel overall of what else is going on in the data. And I encourage you to take a look at this. I always see that as more of like a phase 2 or maybe a phase 1.5. It helps really understand what the overall results are saying. And then finally, my favorite chapter is the all items. The reason I like the all items, quite frankly, is because you could sort every question on the survey by clicking on these little arrows. And this helps me pull the story out. When I look at all the items, I'll say, all right, wait a minute. This question's about emotional well-being. We got one question on emotional well-being. This one's not this one. Oh, the third question's about emotional well-being. This one isn't. Oh, the sixth question is about emotional well-being. I'll start telling a story that way. And then the other thing I'll also do is look at how it compares to the benchmarks. And what you'll see, by the way, is you'll see variability. If I'm performing high relative to OEB, let's say I'm outperforming OEB, but my scores are low for education and low for USA norm, then that tells me, all right, overall OEB isn't performing very well, but I'm doing much better than the rest of the group. So that might be a positive for me. But if I see, oh, I'm performing below OEB, I'm performing below the education norm, I'm performing below the USA norm. All right, maybe that's something I should spend a little bit more time on. And then as you go through these items, you'll get a feel for which ones, hey, are the most important. The general rule of thumb I like to have is I want to have the items that were performing the least well, and then the ones that were performing the most well, I guess. Right. And what this does for me is it helps me create the story of how my part of the organization is working. All right. So this brings me on to the next chapter around interpreting results. I got a little bit into interpreting on the previous chapter, but I'm going to go into a little bit more deeply. When we look at the results of the survey, right, our starting point always is we get the survey. And then we have what we call these interpretive lenses. These are the things that the way I want to look at the data in different ways. Number one, I want to look at the data from a results perspective. And I already talked about, the overall favorability, how we compare to the benchmarks. But there's other ways I want to look at this, which is what is my reaction to it? How do I feel about the data? And we'll talk about that. Another one that's really critical, especially now, especially within education, is the context, right? Our political environment is very different now than it was 2 years ago, than it was 10 years ago. That's going to play a strong part of the context on how I'm going to interpret these data. And then priorities. What are the most important things we have to work on? At the end, what I want to be able to do is tell a basic story with the results. That's really the goal of looking at the data and interpret it. I want to be able to give what like I call the elevator speech. Overall, we're doing this. We're doing well in this. We're doing poorly in this. And these are probably the things we should work on. That should be the end result, which is the basic story, some of the questions we want to ask, and some of the actions we want to take. So the first part of it is we start with the results. What do the pure numbers say? General rule of thumb, 75% or higher is considered a good score. Anything where we have less than 75% people favorable, that's an area that I might want to investigate and look into. And then any area of opportunity, when I start seeing 20% or more unfavorable, I really want to start paying attention to that. Now, it's a general rule of thumb. And here's the thing, there are some questions on surveys that I know will always get pretty high scores. So questions about people's managers typically will show up in the 70s and 80s, right? But if I'm asking questions about workload, workload is typically showing up in the 60s. So not every question is created equal, but usually we want to start with those numbers as sort of the rule of thumb. From there, though, would I want to look at my comparisons to the benchmarks, whether it's OEB overall or to our benchmark norm, right? I want to know, how am I standing out? Do I look good relative to OEB? Am I looking poorly relative to OEB? One other thing I should point out is we do have the different benchmarks, whether it's the education benchmark or the USA norm. The reason we put both of those in there is for a very good reason. Number one, I want you guys to understand that if, let's say, education is performing much lower than everyone else, that means you guys will compare more favorably to education. And that's typically what you'll see in the results. But the other reason we compare the norm is for two reasons. Number one, not every question will be able to provide an education norm, because an education refers to maybe 1/10 of the population of people we study, right? So you're missing 90% of the data. And I want you guys to have at least some benchmark. The other reason I want the benchmark is just because someone's working in education, it doesn't mean they're always going to be working in education. So your competitor isn't necessarily other schools. A competitor where an employee might leave and go someplace else. I work a lot of people that are former teachers. I'm a former teacher myself. I taught college for 7 years until I decided to go out back into business. The competitor of my institution where I worked was business. And you want to know, where can we strive toward? And it gives you sort of a good feel for that. Now, I will say some questions in education, you guys are performing better. Some areas education is performing worse than the benchmark. So just keep your eyes on that. The next step, and this is my favorite part because I'm a psychologist, what's my reaction to the data? This is really important. When I look at the numbers and I was like, okay, Pete told me, where we compared to the benchmarks and 75% or better. Every time I'm looking at this, there'll be 4 different ways I think of it. The first thing is, if the scores are high, I'll feel pretty positive about it. If the scores are pretty low, I'll feel more negative about it. That is the first reaction you'll have, which is pretty obvious. But the other thing is clarity. If I see a result, there's probably some things that you guys are thinking in advance. Oh, you know what? This didn't surprise me at all. Workload has always been a problem here. So I'm not surprised. I'm very clear of the negative results on this because I knew that. But more often than not, what happens is sometimes when people are complaining about stuff, it's like the loudest voice gets the most notoriety. And sometimes we have a false impression of things that maybe aren't as big of a problem. Wow, look at this. I look at these scores, and our scores are not that bad. A very common one is fair pay. Most of the time, people think, oh, fair pay is a huge problem at this company because everyone complains about it. But when you compare to benchmark, rarely is it ever significantly lower. And that typically is something that confuses people in a positive way. So it's just something to keep in mind when reviewing the results. The other thing you want to look at is surprises. Good surprises, bad surprises, just like the example I gave with the fair pay. You want to be able to think about that. This gives you some clarity on what's going on in the organization. And then the last question is, well, what do we need to learn more about? As you look through the results, part of the storyline should always be, am I understanding this the same way? What would other people think? And this helps build the storyline and the questions that you're going to be asking in the feedback meeting. My goal is to ask better questions to get a really good feel. I'm always surprised how frequently I'll interpret something in some way and I'll have a meeting and Christy will say, well, Pete, did you think about it this way? That's a really important part of this conversation, keeping an open mind and making sure we're asking more questions than providing answers. This other part is really critical, which is the context, especially now, especially within education. This is a very weird time in our lives, right? And when we look at the results, we're going to interpret it, one, within my personal life, like what's going on for me, Pete Ritigliano, when I'm looking at these results, and also what's going on with my team. But more importantly, especially what's going on, because there's a lot of turbulence going on in organizations today. It's the economy, it's the political environment, it's what's going on in education. We're getting hit from all sides within education. You want to interpret the results within here, right? What's going on in my region, my market, my location, and how I'm interpreting that within the major context. You want to keep that in mind. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean we just throw our hands up and say, oh, it's the economy, it's the market, it's, the political environment. There's nothing I can do about it. That's not true. There's a lot we could do about it, but we want to interpret it within that context. I have a good example of that a little later, but I'm holding off because I want to save that for later. After I look through all the results, I do my interpretation. And I mentioned this before, we want to tell the overall story. And this is an outline. You don't have to use this. This is just a template that we start with. You want to get a feel for, how healthy and how engaged the employees are based on the scores. We want to look at what are the top 3 strengths we're noticing when we're grouping questions together. What are those 3 themes that are good? Or what are those 3 themes that aren't as good, that are opportunities that maybe we could do something about? And then I also like to put in what are some of the surprises that I've seen. I put down some questions where I want to ask people, what do you think about this? And then topics I want to discuss. When you're going through the results, I'm going to really encourage you, don't go through every question. That's going to bore people to tears. Telling a story makes it more interesting, right? It's the difference between someone telling you a story when they went to the store versus just reading your grocery list, right? The story is always going to be more interesting. People are going to pay more attention to it. Part 3 is the feedback meeting. This is the opportunity where we prepare to tell the story to our coworkers, the other leaders that we're working with, so we can come up with an idea of what are some of the things we should work on. It gets people an understanding of what's going on in the data. So the feedback meeting is an opportunity where we're going to review the results together as a work group. We're going to share ideas about the results and ask questions of each other. This is really when you want to enlist the support and participation of your other colleagues, right? You want to basically put it out in front of people and then just have a discussion on it. The goal of this isn't necessarily to have a list of actions. We might propose some actions. The goal of this is really get a better understanding. One of the things that's going to happen when you guys are going through the results is, I wonder why they asked the question this way, or I wish they would have asked the question that way. On this God's green earth, I'm never going to ask the perfect survey. There's always going to be questions that aren't perfect. And we ask the questions in this manner for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're sufficiently vague in that it'll give us enough information to create dialogue, but they're clear enough that there isn't a lot of variability. We use the same questions all around the world, and we need to be able to translate them, and everyone needs to be able to have a feel for what exactly we're asking with the question. That's why we ask the questions those way. But how it's interpreted varies dramatically from company to company. That's where you guys are going to play in that sandbox. We want to focus on things that are in your control. We want to try to be as collaborative as possible, and we want to focus it where everyone gets a chance to contribute into the conversation. So the checklist, and you guys can review this on your own time. We want to include all of the various leaders or stakeholders that are going to help me drive change. Usually you want to schedule a meeting for about an hour. You want to notify them in advance that this is the purpose of the meeting. And usually you put together an agenda, and there's an agenda in here you can guys follow. You can clean it up as much as you want. I want to list some of the topics we want to cover. I want to talk about the positive results, talking about some sensitive issues. Really, at the end of the day, and I mentioned this before, I don't want to talk about every question on the survey. And I want to try to tell a balanced picture. Usually I call it an insult sandwich. where I first talk about positive results. Hey, wow, we're doing really good on this. This really surprised me. Wow, I'm really happy about this. Then I talk about the opportunities. Wow, these scores are really low. We should do better on this. And then I usually finish up, but overall, I feel pretty good. We got a decent response rate, and it seems like people really want to make a change in the organization. And that's typically how I'll tell the story. So this is the decision guide for it, for the meeting, right? We did define our purpose and agenda. In the meeting, I set the ground rules. In the meeting, we're going to analyze some of our strengths. We're going to explore the opportunities. We're going to talk about the surprises. We want to put things into context, and this is really important. And by the way, about the context, it reminded me when I was a kid, there was a lot of like building on fire and plane crashing movies and stuff like that. And there's always that one person who's screaming and hysterical, and nothing good ever happens to that person. I want us all to be like Sullenberger, right? The guy who landed the plane on the Hudson, right? He didn't have control over the fact that both of his jet engines had, been killed by the geese, I should say, right? He said, all right, what can I do with this situation? He didn't get hysterical. He said, well, what is it that I could do to make a change? I don't have control over the engines, but what do I have control on? Right. And in some ways, the political environment is kind of like Sully with the engines going on. There's a lot of stuff going on. And I want to concentrate people in the meeting. All right, I don't want to just complain about what's going on from a political point of view. I want to create change. And in doing so, we're going to address the key concerns. We're going to try to answer as many questions as possible, and we want to generate open discussion. These are some general rules. These are pretty basic. I'm sure you guys know these, but general rule of thumb, you want to get a lot of dialogue. You don't want to do all the talking, right? Usually I'll set it up with some questions and then have people talk. And I'll ask questions like, well, what do you think? Do you disagree with me? Is there another interpretation? What else could this mean? Those are really great questions. This is a really common thing. I remember working in academics, there was a lot of strong personalities. Um, Try not to get that person to dominate the situation as much as possible. There's some rules we have for that a little bit later on. And we want to make sure that we're having an open and honest discussion about what changes we could take. General rule of thumb, if we get stuck, this is like psychology 101. The first thing we do when we get stuck is we want to ask some questions. Let me see if I understand. Do I understand your question right? Am I getting a feel for what's going on? I'll acknowledge the concerns. And then frequently, if it's just one person who's perseverating around something, I'll ask other people in the group to talk about it. Or if it's something that people are just complaining about something and we beat a dead horse, what I'll frequently do at that point is saying, okay, let's take this and table it for now. Let's get back to this because this is going to involve a little bit more discussion and then go to another area. That's typically the best way to handle it. So overall, this part is pretty simple, right? We're reviewing the results, we're asking questions, we're exploring any of the courses, we're generating possible solutions, not having actions necessarily, but ideas. And then we're going to put together some possible action opportunities. And this brings me to the last part, which is around developing an action plan. General rule of thumb is I like to list actions based on how much control I have over it. And that's what these three categories are. The first category is actions you or your team could do with no approvals. And we gave an example here, which is, oh, we want to increase communication through team meetings, right? We don't need approvals for that. That's something we could run with right away. There might be things that require budget approval approval for one reason or another, right? It's actions that we have to get sign off from somebody else. You guys might not have that, but there might be something, let's say, oh, we want additional training and maybe there's some budget approval for that, or we want to change how we're doing our benefits. And that's information you might have to float up above, right? So there might be some things that require more approval, but there also might be some things that you have no control over it whatsoever. And those things, you don't want to ignore it. You want to talk about it to a certain extent. Again, you don't want to perseverate around it, but basically keep that in a separate bucket list that you could refer to later. One example I use here is about new computer equipment. We can't just tell people, well, we can't talk about that there's no budget for it. We want to be able to communicate, hey, people are still complaining about the system. I know you've probably heard this, but I just want to let you guys know that they're still complaining about our IT system. By the way, everyone complains about their IT systems. And then the last part of it is this, where I identify the priorities. After I've listed all the things that we want to work on, typically at this stage, I'll have like 3 to 5 items that are on my to-do list. And then I prioritize in 2 ways. This first page is, well, what's my current environment, but where do I want to get to? Which would make this a better place to work? And looking at that gap in between those two. And then what is the organizational goals that we have? But then from there, when deciding how to prioritize which actions to take, I look at those actions that will generate the most amount of impact, right? And compare that to how much effort. And what I usually do is the first thing I'll work on is something that should be pretty quick and easy so that we can get a quick win in there, right? Something that doesn't require a lot of effort. It doesn't require a lot of approvals. It's something I can work on right now and make people happy. The things that are harder, I put on my second phase. And the reason I do this is for 2 reasons. One, I want people to recognize immediately, like, hey, I'm taking action on the results. So they really feel that we're making a difference. But then the second thing, it also sets the stage for, all right, this is how we did it easy. And this is going to be a little harder because we're going to hit the next one a little bit harder, right? We want to create a culture of well-being is going to be significantly harder than communicating more about what benefits people have. And I want to make sure people recognize the difference there. When developing the action plans, typically, we follow the SMART action plans. I'm sure you guys have seen this, right? My favorite one is you want to be measurable. How are we measuring? Don't just say more or less, quantify it as much as possible. Try to set realistic goals, and very important, put a time frame on it. And in fact, if you go to the next slide, this is around building effective action plans. So this is a very trite example, but in this example, right, poor ratings on communication, talk with employees regularly to share information, who we can do it with, everyone, when is it needed, as needed. Well, that's a cruddy action plan, right? It's not specifically measurable. We won't know when we're done. And one example I like to use is, with a spouse, hey, can you take out the trash more frequently? And I say, yeah, I'll take out the trash more frequently. And in the course of a year, I took out the trash 1 time more this year than last year. Well, all right, technically that's measurable, but is it going to feel like I'm making an effort? Not really. So when we put together our communication plan, right, poor ratings on communication, notice the same survey result. We want to improve communication and establish a regular cadence for communicating, right? This is our desired outcome. What's my action? Have weekly meetings to update employees on latest events, get their input on current issues, review resources, set monthly one-on-one discussions, right? It's a lot more specific. Who's going to do it, right? I identified someone. And then more importantly, when is it going to happen? I'm going to do this by the end of the week, and I'm going to follow up on a regular basis. You want to try to be as measurable as possible. The last slide I call my James Bond slide. Remember James Bond movies? They always set up this really intricate way of killing James, and then they would leave, just assuming everything was going to be fine, right? This is the James Bond slide, which if the bad guys in the James Bond movies only did this, James wouldn't have been around. 007 wouldn't have been around. After you implement some action, you want to check and say, hey, is the plan working? Is it having the outcome that we're hoping for it to have? Why or why not? One of the biggest things is, does it need more time? You don't want to, it takes easily 6 months for any plan to start getting some legs. So does it need more time is the first question you can always ask. Then decide, hey, should we stay the course? Or maybe we should revise it a little bit, right? We want to make sure we could have the best outcome as possible. And then determine how much of the plan you want to change, right? We don't want to be like Bluto and, 007 movies where James Bond always got away because they were just so convoluted and he never checked up on the plans. So final thoughts. Again, we reviewed this pretty quickly and we have time for questions, which is good. Number one, we went through an understanding report. I went through that fairly quickly. Want you guys to really work on understanding and interpreting the results. Sometimes, by the way, when you're interpreting the results, you might like, I don't understand this at all. It's like, great, that's a question in the list. When you go to your team and your leaders are meeting about the results, that's something you could bring up. I don't know what that meant. And what's great about your environment is you guys could always ask other agencies in this, hey, this we got a bad result in this. How did you guys interpret that? Especially organizations that are similar to yours. Maybe there's some learnings that you could pass between the two of you. We want to do the feedback meeting and you want to set action plans. Like I said, I've seen organizations make huge changes over time. And this is our opportunity to make a more engaging workforce, to make it a more an organization of well-being and make people, happier at work and hopefully have a happier life if at all possible. Hey, I'm going to stop sharing right now and open it up to the mic. You guys have any questions or Teresa, is there anything you want to comment on or add color commentary to?
Thank you, Pete. Thanks for that presentation and deeper dive into the reports. I think that some of the folks who are on this webinar are new to the information. They did not attend Debbie's webinar. So I'm glad you went into each section in more detail. I don't see any questions specifically about your presentation in the chat, although I did respond to some questions that came up about the reports, where they can be found. Someone had a question about participation. So I'm going to get back to folks separately so we can let them know, yes, this many people responded from your school district or from your ESD. And I also wanted folks to know that we stuck very closely to that 200 minimum standard when we were analyzing the data, because that was the information we were understood to be the rule for data analysis. But we've since then learned that that has changed and it'll be different the next time. So we'll be able to do more discrete, smaller numbers analysis, which is especially important when we look at our real DSOG data, because those are smaller populations. So I will open it up to now and ask if folks have any specific questions. And I do not see or hear any, so. Oh, someone's typing in the chat, so we'll give it a minute. Oh, the question about what the meeting, the webinar with Debbie Melnick was one of the leads on the survey project. And Debbie took folks to the platform, which you need access to, that you can do some more, not data analysis per se, but that you can look at the survey results in more detail than what you can see at the link I put in the chat. These are PDFs of the reports, but the platform, you can do a little bit more deeper dive into the questions and the responses. And I can't remember if we taped that webinar, and if so, where we posted it. And I don't know if Sarah's on the call and if she recalls. Amy wants to know, okay, and Siri, how do you get access to the platform? You ask me, and I will fill out a form that goes to Debbie, and Debbie gives you a unique link and a password, a process for a password, so that you can get in there as many times as you want and take a look. Amy's asking, can we share the results with your team? Absolutely. That's what this webinar was all about, is to help you understand your school or school district's report a little bit better, so that you can then share that with your wellness committee, your decision makers, your leaders, the people who need to know, your constituents. Any other questions before we go? If anyone on the call is interested in the PEB survey results, Pete is repeating this webinar, but for PEB at 1:05 today. So do let me know right away if you want to attend that, and I'll send you the invitation.
And be prepared. I probably will tell the same jokes.
Well, thank you, everyone. Do reach out to me if questions or concerns come up after the webinar. I'm happy to help. That's what we're here for. We want people to understand and use this information to help improve the health and well-being of your colleagues and your employees. So have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thanks, Pete.
Bye, everyone.